the saddest part is that all of that lovely, weird banter about setting the levels, I didn't record, so we're just recording now.
That's better. I don't think people would have liked that.
No? You think they would have hated that?
It was boring.
I mean, yeah. Are you worried that we're getting boring?
Oh, no. I don't think that's a major concern, at least not yet. It could become a concern in the future.
It's weird. I feel
You feel more boring?
I don't think we're getting boring, but I feel like for a good 8 or 9 months, I would just sit down with you and I'd be like, it always works. We can talk about whatever. And I'm getting a little more anxious. Maybe it's just because maybe more people are paying attention. So I just feel
what do you
some
think's
sort of pressure.
changed in the last few months?
There's
though?
more people are paying attention maybe. So it just feels like we ought to be upping our game somehow. I mean, we've been talking about upping our game a lot and then just sort of like sitting down like this, with not much of an agenda. It's a little daunting.
Yeah, but look, I think from what I recall, I think that our last few episodes have been really well received, but not just the ones with the guests, because that's a little bit different. But even when it's just me and you, the last one we did, sort of tete-a-tete, Damir and Shadi, I think there was definitely some plaudits. I don't remember what we talked about.
I do. I mean, because I was amped up for that one. That one was no problem. That was game stonk.
Yeah, that was good.
Yeah, that was exciting.
But so then, what's the issue if the last one was good?
Well, the issue is that there's our second. Is it the second? The third impeachment. The second impeachment is going on of Trump, and I've just been completely distracted with quote unquote real work. So I've followed it through the headlines, and that's about it. So I mean, part of that is because I think the in the sense that one tries to read the news in a way that's a good use of one's time. Maybe it's wrong of me to assume that there's not even a snowball's chance in hell that he's going to get convicted. So why pay that much attention to it? It just seems almost pointless. I don't know. Is that a bad way to think about it?
So my only concern about this episode is precisely this, that like you, I haven't been following the news. I've probably been following it even less than you, insofar as I know that there's an impeachment proceeding, but I don't even know what the headlines are. I'm vaguely aware of Nikki Haley saying some things that people were getting excited about. I don't know how important that is. But I feel like to focus on impeachment right now, like in terms of like my own mind space, it seems like an utter waste of time. Nothing good can come out of that, I don't think. So I'm not even interested. I don't even find it to be an interesting story. He gets impeached. He doesn't. Does it really change much? I'm not sure. But I think it's what we purposely try to avoid here on Wisdom of Crowds, which is the day-to-day noise that has no bearing on the bigger cultural, political, and religious questions that I think we're most interested in.
I mean, one way just to think about that, jump in before we move on to other things, though, there's like a meta question. It's quite possible we're missing the biggest story ever, because in some ways, even though I guess I'm somewhat convinced that there's no way they're going to convict him, if they did convict him, it would be a really important story. I mean, it would be certainly at that point an indication of a major fraction in the Republican Party, and then one of those things that I guess sort of has been rattling in the back of my mind. Again, it's sort of the background noise of this podcast since we started it. Is the question of let's say the party were to fragment right now, and Trump has been sidelined off of social media and all the rest of this, and then he is somehow the Democrats managed to convince enough of their colleagues to convict, and therefore he is, I guess, barred then from ever running again. Now it's interesting. I mean, given there was that story in the New York Times that he actually was sicker than was let on by COVID.
Yeah,
maybe he won't even survive 4 years, right? But it's then it becomes a meta question. It's also interesting to me, which is, can the discontent and the Trumpian flavor of discontent, and how will it last without Trump? I mean, obviously, I saw Max Boot wrote a column. Again, just saw the headline. I didn't bother reading, but it was something along the lines of Trump in office was the greatest threat to democracy Tucker Carlson is the current greatest threat to democracy. So again,
What?
I mean,
How is Tucker Carlson the greatest threat?
I didn't read.
That doesn't even make any sense.
Well, at least that is part of the what's it called, the zeitgeist these days, right? I mean, we've both been sort of writing about this. It's this idea that if only the people weren't riled up to irrationality, rationality would somehow reassert itself. I mean, I think that's nonsense, but sometimes I wonder if we were to make Max Boot emperor of the world, and he was able to basically silence all the voices of irrationality, and there was a possibility to just silence all the forces of reaction, whether people would then just go back to just being, that the post-Cold War happy Americans, that there was some kind of broad center of consensus there that could be reached, and the old centrist elites could rule, and we'd have nice wars of freedom abroad, and all the good stuff that led us to this point.
That's what we loved about that era.
Yeah, right.
The wars of freedom.
Wars of freedom, and I mean, maybe I just wonder, Obviously, it's a nightmarish proposition that, like, taken to its extreme, that you need to regulate speech to a certain point to be able to preserve democracy, and I just don't think it's going to fly in this country. But again, as you know yourself, it's not. That's to see that as a complete non-starter is a very American thing. I mean, Germans, for example, are quite fine with regulating all sorts of things to keep completely undemocratic and illiberal voices.
And that's worked really well, considering that the leader of the opposition in the German parliament is the far-right, supposedly neo-Nazi party, the AfD. So there are limits to the effectiveness of these approaches.
Right.
I mean, here's the thing. I mean, it's a supply and demand issue. If there's a demand for far-right policies, political entrepreneurs are going to come out and meet that demand. I just don't know how you get around that when people are free to start their own parties and express opinions on a variety of platforms. It's really hard to keep these things under the rug or under the table, whatever the expression is.
Right.
Under the table.
Under the rug that's under the table.
But like what you laid out is actually extremely frightening, and I think that our listeners should be aware of some of the worst case scenarios. I think that you sort of put your finger on the button. I feel like I'm just like making up like a finger on the button, which would be the dystopia that would be Max Boot as philosopher, king, emperor.
Yeah.
And banning reactionary forms of speech, and he would be the one to presumably adjudicate that. I mean, it's a fascinating idea, and I think every American citizen has to ask him or herself, do I want to live under such a regime?
Right.
But look, I mean, it reminds me too of the joke that we had, and wait, I don't know if we can say this publicly, the Max Boot joke.
What, like minimum shoe? That one?
Yeah, Max Boot, minimum shoe. I hope people appreciate that little humorous touch.
Yeah, the thing, it's one of those things that I'd always throw out there when my more liberal friends would be like, I mean, this ban Fox stuff has been in the air way before Trump. Well, maybe not way before Trump, but certainly in the last 4 years of Trump, it's been in the air. And I've always said, like, if Fox didn't exist precisely on your supply and demand premises, I would found it and be a rich man. I mean, is really what it comes down to. Now, even though they advertise, like, I don't know, gold and other weird things, I guess, on Fox News. I don't watch Fox News, but that it's low rent sort of advertising and all the rest of this. But it's still it seems to be a profitable venture. And yeah, I mean, it's your point is like if there's a demand for this sort of stuff. If there's a demand for this sort of stuff, leadership will be supplied eventually. But I wonder, is that too glib at the same time? I mean, there is a role for leadership to shape the discussion. Maybe that's just impossible today, given again, this is not an original thought here, but given the information landscape and just in general the way things operate and work right now, maybe it's just impossible to to have that anymore. That kind of I don't know, tight control over discourse, right?
Well, I think the bigger issue is that people are angry, but they're angry for legitimate reasons. So I think that this is the bigger structural issue here, that the anger isn't necessarily unfounded. So as long as a growing number of Americans feel that something is fundamentally wrong in our society, we're going to have reactionary anti-establishment movements, certainly on the right, also perhaps on the left. We'll see how that evolves in the coming years. I guess that's sort of what wokeism is about, although it's kind of odd because wokeism is dominant culturally in many respects, at least in elite institutions. So, but I feel like what's interesting about populism on these sort of, well, is wokeism really a populist thing? It's more like an elite sensibility. So maybe it doesn't really fit into this mode of analysis. But the bigger issue here is that people are angry and they have every right to be. And to treat, like we always go back to this, the cause and the symptom issue, that if we see the Trump years as merely an aberration, we're misunderstanding something fundamental about our current political moment. So people are chilling a little bit now because, it's the early days of the Biden administration. But this stuff is going to keep on coming back if we don't have leaders who actually are bold, who actually address the deeper structural issues. And I think what we found out is that even competent leaders aren't competent. This is sort of a riff on my members only piece for Wisdom of Crowds, which we can include in the show notes. And maybe this is a good time to do the marketing pitch.
Do it. Well, if you want access to this piece that will be in the show notes, pay us money. There's the marketing pitch.
Exactly. And no, seriously, guys. I mean, there are thousands of you who listen to the podcast. We don't need all of you to become members or subscribers, but if you like what we do, consider it. What we try to do with some of these members only pieces, that we show the first paragraph or two, and maybe if it whets your appetite, you might want to, dive in and see what you find. I mean, so what I said in this, before I forget, you can do that by going to wisdomofcrowds.live/subscribe. Okay, marketing spiel done.
Good, check.
Is it spiel or spiel? Because I think one of our dear listeners brought this up before, Mark Schleifer, I think, that he thought I mispronounced Spielberg. Well, it can't be spiel because it's like
Steven Spielberg and it's spiel. Go on.
But I think it tells us something about our moment, that we, at least liberals, seem to love the idea of competence, and we fetishize competence. But really, when it comes down to it, competence is really hard to achieve. And I think we're seeing that certainly when we talk about the EU, the disastrous vaccine rollout. These are the leaders that center-left Americans had been idealizing and saying, if only we could be more like Macron or Merkel or whatever it might be. But if we look at the EU itself, these are supposed to be intelligent, well-educated, well-meaning, well-intentioned. They're trying to be technocratically efficient in all the various ways, but it's a shit show.
Yeah.
So that tells us something.
Yeah. Well,
it's an illusion, this idea of competence. And we might, ask ourselves, is competence in any sustainable fashion, is it even possible in a country as big as ours? Like, it's possible in New Zealand, it's possible in, say, Israel, and they're doing quite well with the vaccine rollout there, very well, in fact. But a country as unwieldy and as divided as ours, is competence simply beyond reach? And we can obviously have different gradations of competence or lack thereof. So I'm not going to pretend here that Biden isn't more competent than Trump, but still, it's a very low bar. But maybe that's enough to clear that low bar, is maybe good enough for a lot of people.
Well, let's. I mean, I want to just row it back a little bit because it is something we talk about here, and we haven't actually been taken to task for it, but I think it's worth digging into a little bit. I mean, people have been taken to task about this very broadly, about the Trump phenomenon and sort of, just in general, the populist rise, perhaps even on the left. But what is the source of the discontent here? I mean, there was a set of polls that came out. I guess they asked a bunch of voters. I'll try and dig up the link. They asked a bunch of voters. They listed, I guess, Biden's executive orders, and maybe described them in a sentence or something like that, and said approve or disapprove. Broadly popular, but all the asylum border stuff, very unpopular. Or markedly unpopular, like 39% approve or something like that. Yeah. And so, the thing that I just tweeted one quick little thing, glancing at those numbers, I said, just important to remember, how it is that Trump won in 2016. And then it's true that, so a lot was written about the resentments and the frustrations of Trump voters in this way and that way and the rest of it. And then, the flip side, the sort of liberal, almost like, mainstream, but, shading into woke narrative is that, Americans are just xenophobic and racist. And it's that kind of like racial resentment that's driving this. I think that's way too pat. But it's when we talk about this very general sense of discontentment, yeah, I wonder about it. It's not that I mean, certain people certainly are impacted by immigration and their wages have perhaps been affected and jobs going out, and there's a kind of reaction against that. But in a way, right, it's immigration in Trump's hands was just a calling out of the fact that, the moment we find ourselves is somehow not satisfying, that some need wasn't being met by our current ruling elites, that they had somehow maybe just ceased to credibly represent us or something like that. And immigration was just an easy way to sort of map that onto it. I don't know. I'm not an immigration specialist, but I sometimes wonder, to what extent it's a proxy issue. And in the same sort of way, I wonder that whether on the left, you as a Bernie supporter, you've talked about, general sort of inequality and other things. But in many ways, you think about it, it's a kind of reaction against the paradigm, the ruling paradigm that has brought us here, globalization, the rest of this. It's just like no one's speaking up for us in a way, and it's arguably a less racist thing, even though Bernie himself was caught by Ezra Klein, saying that open borders is a Koch plot back in the day before Bernie was, put in his place, and he wouldn't say that again today. But you know what I mean? It's I wonder how performative in many ways any issue-based discontent is. I don't know. Do you have a sense of what the source of this discontent is?
I think you're onto something that, and I think that you've actually been one of the few people, if I can sort of just indulge you a little bit, who has really, I think, identified this. So when you made the argument the other week, I think you wrote it in one of your pieces for us. You can tell me which one it is, but you basically said that the claims of voter fraud and the election being stolen from Trump wasn't actually about an objective assessment of whether the election was actually stolen. It wasn't meant to be a factual statement. It was a means to signify opposition to a kind of status quo and to an elite consensus. And that these were Trump supporters who were angry, and it mattered less what the specific claims of voter fraud were. What mattered more was that these were people who still felt disenchanted by the system or by the way of things, And I think that a lot of policy preferences aren't actually about the policies in question. They are signaling mechanisms. And I mean, we've talked about this before in certain ways. I mean, my support for Bernie, as I think you alluded to, isn't actually about policy preferences. Bernie is a proxy for me. He's a way to signify that I'm angry about a broader set of concerns. So when people say, well, Shadi, do you think the marginal tax rate should be like 70%? That's not really important to me. first of all, I'll never be in that bracket, so it's certainly not important for me in a very kind of personal, self-interested sense. But I don't. For I also think authenticity is important in a politician, and if you take those two things, authenticity and using a candidate or a politician as a signaling mechanism, Bernie becomes very compelling. That doesn't mean that Bernie isn't right on specific policy issues. It only means that that's not what's fundamentally driving me as an individual. And I have to be honest about that. And I don't want to pretend that I'm someone who has read in detail Bernie's economic proposals and has strong opinions about them. But for most of us who aren't experts in a particular field, I'm not really the right person to adjudicate the economic feasibility of some of Bernie's more controversial proposals. So then it's less of an issue of whether something works. Also, the very frame that the reason we would support a policy proposal is if it works is itself problematic, because it assumes a technocratic premise that for a policy to be worthwhile, it actually has to work. I don't believe that policies are only worthwhile if they work. I think policies can be worthwhile even if they fail.
So what do you think is driving your particular discontent? Like what element of, well, let's just say, I mean, is it fair to say you've been politically sentient, let's say? I mean, you certainly remember Clinton, but you'd say like Bush was the really sort of opening, like when you really sort of became active, right? Mentally and more engaged in things, right? Is that fair?
Certainly, yeah.
So,
yeah,
I mean,
that's because of Bush, and that's more because of 9/11 and the Iraq War.
Sure. All I'm trying to get a time frame, not necessarily the president. So we're talking, but basically, Bush and Obama, and after those 16 years, you want to lodge a protest, and Bernie is the cudgel nearest to you that's most sympathetic, because you wouldn't vote for Trump because that's not your game. But there's a similar sort of instinct that something's not being done right. Can you excavate that a little bit for me? Like, where's that coming from? I mean, I'll share my sort of impulses in this, which are less tied to politics. It's something else with me. But like, I don't know. Why don't you go first and just sort of like, if you can, just sort of think through that a little bit.
Something not quite being right is precisely the right way of describing it, because it's vague, because it's hard. It's not the easiest thing to define where my sense of something not being quite right is coming from. And that's why I think for a lot of people, it's more about a sense, a gut feeling. And that's why it's easy to dismiss, because we can't always put it clearly in words. It's not about specific policy objections per se. I will say that, just as a little side note, that I was politically sentient to some extent even before Bush. And I don't want to go into this too much because it's just like a fun fact and it has no relevance to our current conversation. But I remember in high school, I became known, and this is maybe where I first became known as a contrarian. Everyone was vaguely liberal or left of center in an undiscerning way. I mean, we were in the suburbs of Philadelphia. It was an upper middle class kind of context, a public school, but a very well regarded one. And in that kind of setting, everyone is going to be this kind of standard issue liberal. Not really well thought out. No one really knows exactly why they're a liberal. It's just not cool to be a conservative or a Republican. And they're seen as like stodgy and moralistic. And they're not like a little bit uptight about matters of, I suppose, sexual ethics or abortion, things like that. And that was my entry point into my vaguely Republican sympathetic politics in the late 1990s, that I came from a more, practicing household. Religion was a part of my upbringing. And that was a time when Muslims were generally more sympathetic to the Republican Party because of those moral issues. And so there was a discourse growing up, whether it was at the local mosque or Sunday school, that there was a sense of moral regression. And this was during the Clinton years and during Monica Lewinsky and all that. So I think some of those developments magnified that sense that we were morally apart from where mainstream society was going. And that's the kind of sentiment that I started to express at the lunch table in high school in the cafeteria. And I just got a rise. I got a rise out of people, and I found it fun because I was the only one who could kind of like, semi-intelligently express some of the discomfort with the cultural consensus at that time. And it just, it was a way to, not to like, I think probably it was a way to stand out. I think in high school, all of us are looking for our own identity. And I think that I didn't really fit in entirely. I wasn't like I wasn't in the loser group, thank God, because that would have been devastating.
Wait, so you became a conservative to not be in the loser group? Is that what you're saying?
No, they're not related. I'm just saying it wasn't that bad. It's not like it ever got to the point where I was in the lowest social group. I would say that I was between the lowest social group and like the middling people. So I was in the kind of I was in a vulnerable position. It's sort of like how if you look at the folks who join like Islamist movements in the Middle East, they tend to be middle class, but those with frustrated ambitions. So they actually have a lot of potential, or they think they have a lot of potential, but something is blocking them. Not to extend the metaphor or analogy too much, but I think that those of us who felt like we were at risk of being pushed to the lowest rung of the high school status ladder, so we had frustrated ambitions of our own. So I had to think like, how can I make myself seem, more relevant or more interesting or whatever? And maybe this was one way. I'm just speculating here. I don't know. I haven't thought about this.
I'm just speculating about a hypothesis here.
But I'm trying to also make a bigger point that I think that's a hard position to be in.
Okay. Go on. Finish. I was just going to push you then, like, is there any connection between that and sort of the broader, do you see a kind of broader thing at play here that's like more socially broad than that? Like
you're like Shadi, this is all interesting.
Well, no, I could imagine some of your less charitable readers latching onto this little confession here and being like, this explains everything.
But here's the thing: it doesn't really explain. It doesn't really say a lot about my position now, because I don't think that my issue now is one of status or frustrated ambition, unless people want to psychoanalyze me or something.
Yeah.
I think that my discontent comes from actually being kind of content about a lot of things. I told you this on a text message, a private one, the other week. Like I was a little bit, I was down about some things last week, I guess. And I think that part of it is I'm very grateful for what I have. I think that I'm content with where I am in different aspects of my career and my writing. But that also makes this kind of underneath the surface bubbling dissatisfaction more striking, because it doesn't have a clear source. And that makes me more nervous about it.
I wonder if there's a broader sort of, maybe it's some kind of product of prosperity, right? I mean, that we're all looking for the oppressed masses, but in fact, America's a very successful society that has a lot of inequality, and like racial problems, violence, healthcare is a disaster, all the rest of that. But whether on some level there's just some kind of something else. I don't know. For me, I've written about this sort of in passing over the years. It sort of keeps coming up. The thing that I always sort of I don't like either side. I've never liked either side, and I guess I'm always drawn to pick at things that seem hypocritical and or conventional wisdom in a lot of ways. And it started, like I said, I've written about this. It started most of all watching, the Balkan Wars in the 1990s. And then ever since then, all of the kind of, happy talk about democracy and progress and, the end of history stuff is just struck me as off, like missing something really important about it. I wrote an essay in the American Interest years ago now, that democratic determinism essay, which starts off from that premise, because I just remember, the Balkan Wars were not supposed to happen. Cold War was won, liberal democracy was just taking over, and then what was this? And so the solution was, the answer was basically, it's like, ancient hatreds, barbarism of a backward people, but they'll come around, it'll be fine. And so it's not with any sort of glee that I watch what's happening, but at the same time, it's a kind of perverse satisfaction at watching it unravel in a way and saying, no, you had it all wrong from the beginning. You don't understand why good things that you have are good and how they work. And in so many ways, I've just been sort of trying to unpack, first, on the one hand, figuring out what it is about America that is good. How does it work? Why does it work? What is the role of certain beliefs in the society, both organized, religious beliefs of which I don't really partake because I'm not religious at all, but also the sort of secular faith in America and the sort of mythology, and how important it is to keep some of these things, in place and tended to and healthy. I think we've done a terrible job of that. But it's also, it's because all of these things that I think our elites talk about a lot, that they think are the holy things, are so misunderstood by them and such false gods in a way that also it gives me a real perverse pleasure to see it explode in their face. That's I guess what's driving me. It's kind of nerdy and intellectual, but this is why ultimately I'm not comfortable with the right. I wasn't comfortable with the right when they were when they were the champions of these false gods under George W. Bush with the whole freedom agenda and democracy and freedom and horse shit. But also watching it now happen when you have the sort of center left and the broad center, the former elites, they're just talking nonsense. And in doing so, and in being as vehement as they are, they're mirroring exactly the forces and giving succor to the forces. And this goes back to I thought, which still I think was one of the better essays of last year, Aaron Sibarium's essay on the Weimarization of politics. I mean, I think it just nails the dynamics so well. And and so I even among our friends, I sometimes get accused of evincing a certain kind of glee as I watch some of this stuff happen. But that glee is really born of a kind of I don't know, just like a built up years of just listening to stuff that just always struck me as bullshit and that I could never convincingly prove that it was bullshit. So watching events somehow bear this out has been satisfying, even while the whole experience of the last 4 years longer has been horrifying to watch it all come apart.
Yeah, and I've been driven by this somewhat as well, that I think that many of these people deserve a comeuppance because they're wrong, not just in the obvious ways, because Trump voters or supporters have been wrong in ways that are clear-cut and somewhat straightforward. These are people who are wrong, maybe, let's say, utterly wrong for the right reasons, or maybe that's not quite the right formulation, but they're so rationalist and well-intentioned and technocratic, but also sometimes not technocratic when they descend into wokeism. There's a self-righteousness, there's a self-satisfaction, and these are the very people that you want to see proven wrong. So I think that's part of it. I would say that one thing I don't like about our current, let's say, cultural elite, to oversimplify, is that there's a certain decadence, there's a certain kind of late stage Roman Empire vibe to it, of people who are so unmoored from what is really fundamental in life. And this goes back to my sort of spiritual and religious preoccupations. I think a lot of this really, for me at least, it gets back to the decline of religion. And by religion, I mean specifically Christianity in America, but also just more broadly of, Christianity is the majority religion somewhat, even though that's changing. So naturally, if there's a religion problem in the US, it will also be a Christianity problem by definition. And I think that the being unmoored from the kind of Christian heritage, I'm going to sound kind of reactionary here. Heritage seems to be a reactionary word, so I hesitate.
So many words are becoming reactionary these days, though. So I mean, whatever. Just
everything is reactionary.
Just proceed.
Yeah, I think that when you lose sight of part of who you are, and I think that you can't understand the American self-conception without understanding the role of Christianity. Of course, taking into account that many of the founders were not particularly Christian, but still, if we look at it more broadly, and if we look at the nation and the role that Christianity has played until the last few decades, Christianity has played more of a role in the American self-conception than, say, in the German self-conception or the French self-conception. And that matters. And I think that if you lose that, you lose something important about who you are. And that affects how, so you have an elite. And I think we talked about this in the previous episode, that if we look at the Hollywood, if we look at popular culture, it diverges so much from the median voter in terms of basic sensibilities that the gap is actually quite large. So I have a preoccupation with decadence. I liked Roz Douthat's book about it. I think it's probably if you want to read one thing on understanding what decadence means and what its implications are for the future of the US, I think Ross's book is a good place to start. I also have odd preoccupations about this. I don't mean to make a joke out of this, although it may be perceived as such. But one reason that I can't stand dogs is I find them to be a very simple encapsulation of this broader decadence problem. It seems, okay, I don't want to say too much about this because this goes a little bit personal, but for example, there's nothing, on dating apps, for example, there are a lot of women who pose with their dogs. Yeah. I find this, to me, I can't imagine what could be more decadent than this. I just struggle to understand what is driving these people. And maybe it shouldn't annoy me as much as it does. And I'm just being a bit of a curmudgeon. And certainly I'm a misanthrope. I make no...
bones. Make no bones about it.
I make no dog bones about it.
Dog bones about it, yeah.
But here's the thing. Why does that... let me try to think about this for a second. Why does that bother me so much? These I don't know.
It's a an economic sinkhole that people put stuff into, resources that would have gone to children. Perhaps. That's the standard conservative line on this. Is that it?
Yeah, I think it's part of it. It's like we're trying to find personal satisfaction from a domesticated animal because we can't find it in the normal places. That's certainly part of it. There's a certain luxury to it. From what I understand, to have a dog, you got to spend a shitload of money over time. And it just seems odd from a economics maximizing standpoint why you would want to put a lot of your money into something that is an animal. I don't even know what the words are to describe this, but also I think, as someone who likes my freedom, the idea that you would have to wake up at a particular moment or interrupt your social activities with your friends because you have to walk the dog. So we don't have that problem in our friend group. And that's why no one, if we want to hang out with each other, none of us has a dog. So it's never an issue.
None of us have children either yet, Shadi. So, I was just going to point out here, you a proponent of, wanting to settle down and have kids. Get ready, my friend. Yeah.
But where am I going with this? I feel like I've just gotten stuck in sort of like this dog zone in my own
Yeah.
mind, and I can't even. But the last thing I'll say about it is, when resources are scarce, people don't buy dogs.
Right. But wait, we're talking about decadence here. And I mean,
Yeah,
I understand you latching onto this as a particular thing, but why is it threatening? I mean, again, sure, decadence. And maybe this decadence is making us restless, and therefore just sort of projecting this kind of restlessness onto symbolic protest candidates. That would be the ultimate decadence, right? That we've forgotten the importance of self-governance and the kind of discipline and kind of virtue that's required of that. So now these sort of end of history hollow men that we are sitting here. With our dogs.
But if Bernie is anything, Bernie is undecadent because he doesn't have time for bullshit. He has clarity of purpose. He's authentic. So what his outside is similar to his inside. Like there isn't a sort of cognitive dissonance.
Just like Trump, very authentic, right? Trump is the most authentic candidate.
Yeah, but Trump doesn't have. So when I think about authenticity, I also think about moral clarity. I find Trump to be very contradictory in a way that Bernie isn't. Bernie is consistent. He is who he is. I guess you could say Trump is who he is. And this was always, I think, what people found appealing, that he says it like it is, but it wasn't, it was always utterly inconsistent. So he was open about that, and he would go all over the place. Maybe people appreciated that there was no pretense to consistency, but I don't think it's quite the same thing.
So, I mean, what we're looking at then is I mean, I share I'm less troubled by the decadence. I just sort of take it for granted that that's what it is. And I mean, it's and I haven't read Ross's book, but if I read some of the excerpts, I think they had in the New York Times or elsewhere, and a couple of the reviews. I mean, he's not that troubled by it either. I mean, isn't where the book ends up saying that basically, decadence can last forever, or like for a very long time. Empires last for a very long time in the decadent phase. It's not collapse. It's not imminent collapse or anything like that. It's just frivolity in a way, right?
Which is also depressing in its own right, that we're going to be on this endless repetition loop, being decadent, but kind of muddling through and having very high standards of living relative to the rest of human history.
Yeah.
And we'll probably get away with it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess I wonder, that's the thing. And, maybe going back to your piece, I don't have I don't want to mess with my laptop since we're recording on it, and I left my iPad in the other room. Read the Gene Kirkpatrick quote from your piece, because I thought that was really good.
I see what you're doing here, hyping up the members' content.
Yeah, that's
okay.
Right. Yeah, I think we already teased this onto the Twitters, so it's okay.
Yeah, let me pull it up right now. Okay. So the Gene Kirkpatrick quote, I presume probably late 80s, early 90s, I think, goes thus.
Dramatic reading.
Quote, "The Arab world is the only part of the world where I have been shaken in my conviction that if you let people decide, they will make fundamentally rational choices."
Yep. Well, so, we can
obviously... People did bring up that she's sort of contradicting her own position. So people were like, well, Shadi, actually Kirkpatrick also doubted that Latin American peoples would make rational choices, which is one reason that she supported right-wing dictatorships in a number of countries, not just in the Middle East. But, fair enough.
No, that's a good point.
But, I think that it's fair to say that because folks in Latin America did become more rational as the 80s went on. So by the end of the 80s, going into the 90s, democracy spread through Latin America, and generally people weren't voting for Marxists or socialists. They were voting for leftist parties to some extent, some of the time, but center-left, So the socialist threat was mitigated. And of course, this was coming at the end of the Cold War, when socialism just simply wasn't as tenable. So I think that it's fair to say that when we look back, the Arab world has stood out. in many ways for the seemingly irrational proclivities of voters on a mass level. And I think that's what Jean Kirkpatrick is speaking to here. But of course, I personally don't think that voting for Islamist parties is irrational. That's partly what she was referring to in that case.
Yeah, I mean, the only reason I bring it up is because
Yeah.
not just the Middle East and the rest of that. I mean, we can have a long discussion about that, but it's what struck me about that. Why I think it was such a great quote to dig up and surface right at this moment is specifically all that we've been talking about tonight, and that's this idea. You just said, and the reason I asked you to say it, you said like, maybe we can muddle through this for a very long time. But if the electorate chooses to actively be irrational in a way, our system, Kirkpatrick's not wrong, at least in passing, to point to the fact that the functioning of our system requires a belief in this kind of melioristic, rational based outcome. Or maybe it doesn't require it to function, but it's a core belief, put it that way.
Is it though?
It is. I mean, this is why Rawls is number one and is so core to most American self-understanding and Europeans, quite frankly. It's a Western conceit. This gets back to part of that thing that I was alluding to, which is like part of the core lie of this superficial understanding of democracy and liberalism, is this idea that individuals are fundamentally, and if allowed to sort of deliberate, that reason brings the best out, and necessarily, reason and rationality and good outcomes triumph from this. I mean, again, I know you've spent a lot of time poking holes in that. I mean,
I disagree, but Damir, I'll challenge you on this.
Go on.
I have a different theory of the case.
Hit it.
In fact, I'll coin a new term to describe my theory.
Go on.
In fact. So I think that I would call this the theory of the Okay, let me do this again. Okay. Shadi, this is your moment to shine.
Shine.
To fight Rawls in the annals of history.
Good Lord, come on. Come on now.
Okay. I think that I would call this the theory of the conservation of irrationality. In other words, there is always a constant and high and somewhat high level of irrationality in any given society. What changes over time is how it's expressed publicly.
Totally agree.
So...
You're not challenging me, though, but go on.
Okay. So the irrationality has always been a major part of the American electorate's situation, that there have always been millions of pretty irrational Americans. The only difference now is that these millions of Americans have more access to social media, to public platforms, and so we've become more aware of it. We've talked about this. In fact, I think you've made this point a number of times, and I guess I've made it too, is that, conspiracy theories. Americans have always believed in conspiracy theories, but we weren't freaked out about it because those people did not have access to the New York Times or the nightly news, so we could go about our lives and not worry about it. And as long as, does it matter if millions of Americans believe in crazy things if said millions are basically irrelevant? There's no way to perceive them. There's no way to realize what they're thinking. So it's like if a tree falls in the middle of the forest, and if, let's say, dozens of trees fall in the middle of the forest, or the entire forest falls, but no one is looking at the forest, if you'll indulge my very bad analogy, does it really matter that the trees are falling?
Yeah. Yeah, well, so look, this gets back to something that we were kicking around earlier. Here, let me say this. The other part that I'm deeply tickled by Max Boot and the rest of these, former bien-pensant, thought leaders grappling with right now is that I think one of the core things about democracy is that is the sense of a responsible elite that is able to channel this stuff. Now, I mean, let's bracket aside whether doing so is impossible right now due to technology. I think that's a real possibility, and as a result, given the sort of the way things are going technologically, maybe it's not feasible, or at least mass democracy on the scale of something like the United States may not be possible anymore. Maybe smaller democracies, smaller self-governing units could work. I don't know, but just let's bracket that for a side. What's both where I both sort of agree with the current moment in the max boot side, even though they would never put it this way, and this is why I still scorn them, is that their framing of this question is that if we only get rid of a few bad instigators and a few bad rabble rousers, the inherent goodness of the people will rise through and rationality will reassert itself. That's insane. But underlying this is a kind of a rediscovery of the aristocratic ideal in democracy, which is that the mob is a terrible thing, that democracy as an ideal, this is why, smart people throughout the centuries have talked about mixed republics and balancing these forces, that, an absolute democracy is an evil in many readings. And so it's funny to watch these people sort of rediscover it, but they're not there yet. They're talking as if, there's a handful of demagogues that need to be beheaded and then wisdom will reemerge. And again, this is also what I was alluding to earlier. I mean, well, maybe they're right. Maybe a more German-seeming, more I don't know, elite-driven clampdown on this sort of stuff is preferable to just complete free-for-all. But as you said, it's not even necessarily working in Germany. So I don't know. But that's one of the things that I'm also sort of enjoying in watching this, is watching these people who have, I think, a really facile and dumb understanding of democracy rediscover a certain kind of aristocratic ideal and importance of that in governing a republic, basically. And there's something sweet in seeing their hatred of the mob sort of, I don't know, manifest before my eyes, even though they would never put it that way.
It's almost like honey nectar.
Honey nectar, yeah, taste it.
No, but like their disdain is so palpable for the masses. And to be fair, I don't like people particularly either. And I mean, we've talked about how my low level, or sometimes higher than low level misanthropy, whether that can accommodate my commitment to a minimalistic conception of democracy. So I struggle with this too. But I think there's also, at least for me, I think that people also sense in me a valorization of the crowd, that I have a soft spot for wayward Trump supporters. Sometimes they would say too much of a soft spot for them. So, because I guess I don't know them. Like if I spent more time around Trump voters, I'd probably hate them too.
No, I think it's the opposite. I think if I spent more time with Trump voters, I'd like them more. Totally, absolutely. I mean, I think on the individual level, I think people are fundamentally decent. I think that's undergirding for me. I think the problem with democracy is that mobs are terrible, not that individuals are terrible necessarily.
Oh, good point. Good. That's a really good point. I think so. Maybe let me put it to you this way. I think that leftist, well-educated elites. So let me clarify. Sorry, wokish elites or center-left people in major urban centers, I think as individuals tend to be intolerable in a way that individual Trump voters may not be.
Yeah. It's an apples and oranges thing, right? Again, individuals versus a mob. I mean, I think it's very right to point to a certain kind of, mob-like groupthink that's taken over in sort of elite circles here as well. I mean, just behold what's the turbulence at many institutions, not just the New York Times. I mean, we're all having conversations offline with different people who are just sort of shocked. I was just talking to it's funny. A friend of mine works in government actually, and he was just weirdly discovering intellectual dark web stuff. And I was just like, dude, just like stay, be careful. But it's just
That's
like,
old school. Wait,
it is
I
old
mean,
school.
what?
No, but I mean, it's. I'm just seeing. He's been really busy and just sort of doing his work, like nose to the grindstone. So it's a lot of work working in some of these jobs, and it's so he hasn't been paying that much, and he's sort of just like waking up to a certain kind of politics that's enveloping him. He's like, what's going on? And he's like looking for answers. I don't have a problem with intellectual dark web, but I mean that's a different subject that I do have many reservations about where that all comes from as well.
But he should know where the answers can be found.
At our podcast, of course.
No, that's exactly what I was thinking. I mean, he's an ideal candidate to be made aware of the wisdom of crowds.
I think he's aware. I mean, he's a good friend of mine. I hope he's aware. Maybe he's not. I don't know.
You've never talked to him about the podcast?
No, I mean,
Explicitly?
I send him links to stuff. I don't know if he listens to the podcast, but in any case.
Well, maybe on that note, since we're coming on an hour or so, but we should continue this, and we'll do the bonus episode right now after we conclude. And I would encourage all of you that I don't know exactly what we're going to talk about in this special bonus members-only episode, but I guess that the New York Times might come up. I know it's a little bit inside baseball, but I'm sure I have a feeling that will come up. Because that's been a major theme of some of our, maybe it's lame that we care about what's happening, the internal politics of the New York Times. I also want to expand on my misanthropy a little bit.
Do it.
And just in case, I know that's like a big word, but misanthropy just means dislike of people. Let me actually let me see what the actual definition of misanthropy is for our... Okay, misanthropy is the general hatred, dislike, distrust, or contempt of the human species.
There you go.
Human behavior or human nature.
Everything.
I love that. Okay, great. So we'll definitely dive into that. So if you are interested in having access to this bonus episode, please do consider subscribing. At the website link, I don't have to mention it again because I mentioned it earlier.
Yeah.
And we would very much welcome you. And that's where I really offer up my unfiltered thoughts. That's like my no holds barred situation, which will present a number of problems for my career probably in 20 years when I'm being considered for Damir's deputy national security advisor, his little aide de camp. And like when I will be considered for this position, they will go back and they will be like, oh, Deputy National Security Advisor Shadi Hamid, what was he saying when he felt no one was listening? And then they will go back 20 years into the archives and they will find these unfiltered thoughts. And because we'll be even more woke in 20 years, well, that would be weird because if we do become more woke in 20 years, there is no way Damir is going to be National Security Advisor.
This is a paradox. But here's the thing, Shadi. Basically, it's a win-win because to get access to these, they'll have to pay back in the future as well, and you'll just be a little richer as a result of it. As
Endless
they dig up all this
payment
stuff
into the future.